Um, the idea of this is, I mean, this presentation picks up echoes of some of the things that have been themes throughout this workshop. What I want to emphasize in particular is the fact that we need to think of society in terms of the social systems part of it, and the fact that everything is connected to everything else has been recognized for many years, as this quote from Alexander von Humboldt is intended to show. We know that risks cascade through the whole of the Earth system, and these may not just be unidirectional, but risks at the end of the chain may feed back on those at the start, and that the causes of many of these risks are not necessarily the immediate things that happen, but partly in the structure and policies of the whole system, as Forrester pointed out in the 70s. And we've seen that quite strongly in the recent pandemic, where ill preparedness in health systems meant that the impacts of the disease were much stronger than might have been otherwise. But he also pointed out that every decision that we make in some sense is the result of a model, even if it's just a model that you carry in your head of how you think societies operate. So one of the things that we can do from models that try to look at social systems is to look more carefully at what kinds of things can happen and try to tease out what is dynamically possible. So current thinking, things like SSPs or that kind of thing, because they don't have all of the feedbacks in the system available to them, we have no assessment of whether or not those SSPs or RCPs are actually dynamically realizable in practice. So the second thread of this is to do with thinking about social systems. And a few years ago, many of you will have seen, following Rockstrom's ideas of a safe operating space for humanity. So that's the outside circle here. We shouldn't overstep the bounds in terms of things like land use change or climate change, freshwater use, biodiversity, and so on. But Rawathan also pointed out that we need to build up at the same time social justice. So we need to make sure that everyone has adequate access to food and water and health systems, education, that they have a voice, that they have decent work, access to energy and social equity. So we end up with this idea of living within this donut, which is a safe and just operating space for humanity. And this entails not just the kind of things that climate change or ecosystem destruction, but a whole raft of other things. And we don't know to what extent all of these different problems are or are not related to each other. So we know that health, disease, and pandemics are connected in some way to global transport, but also to policies to do with the structures of the system, to do with land use change and deforestation, that they might trigger conflict. We know that mining and trade may be related to warfare, so things like the Arab Spring being suggested to be related to crop failures in the Soviet Union, sorry, in Russia, excuse me, Soviet Union, I'm showing my age. We don't really have a good idea of how all these things are connected together, and that's partly because we do not have the social science equivalents of general circulation models for the atmosphere, or Earth system models for the atmosphere and ocean. Where are these GCM equivalents, and why are they not present yet? And this is related to things that you can pick up. So a few years ago, to great attention, David Attenborough made this statement. It may sound frightening, but the scientific evidence is that if we had not taken dramatic action within the next decade, we could face irreversible damage to the natural world and the collapse of our societies. Now, that last point, the collapse of our societies, we don't really have any strong justification for thinking that social collapse is anywhere on the horizon. So there are suggestions from simplistic models back in the 1970s, limits to growth, that this might happen. But then on the other hand, during the pandemic, we've seen a remarkable level of resilience in access to food, and very little by the way of complete social collapse, although obviously there have been huge difficulties for many people worldwide. The global social system did not fall apart. And again, part of the reason why it's difficult to justify this kind of statement is because we don't have adequate models of the social system. So what I'm maintaining here is that we need to provide the social dynamics and feedbacks that current Earth system models lack. And here's a cartoon representing, to a degree, the state of current Earth system models. So they'll have some kind of solar input, an atmosphere, an ocean, a land surface, ice, a terrestrial vegetation. These may produce a climate change signal as output, which is then fed into economics-based integrated assessment models, which may themselves have some kind of simplified representation of the climate built into them, and then emissions inventories which feed into the Earth system model to try and produce that climate change signal. Very recently, we can add into this system generalized ecosystem models. So it hasn't been the case up until about 2014 that there were global models that included animals. There is now, I'm aware of one extant example of a global model. Here's an example. This example is from Harfoot et al. In 2014, the Mattingly model, which is an agent-based model. And what you're seeing here is estimates of global total biomass for animals. And you can see interesting features like the Sahara Desert and the Tibetan Plateau and the large abundance of biomass in the tropical oceans. So this is a dynamical model driven by climate inputs. But it's really the case that we're missing just about all of the rest of the social systems, apart from these kind of economics-based models. So this is an attempt to represent all of the things that we need to include in order to be able to understand the functioning of the system as a whole. So we have generalized the social ecological systems in this box in green. So that includes some degree of behavioral modeling and land use change in particular. It may include terrestrial vegetation and animals in some sense. Socio-technical systems in this black box. So those include things like infrastructure and mining, and again, may have a degree of interaction with social behavioral models. And then going horizontally here, socio-political systems. And as far as I'm aware, there are very few models, for example, of government or governance, dynamical models, that is. Economics models have tended not to include finance. And behavioral economics tends to include some degree of macroeconomic behavior, but then maybe not land use change, whereas land use change models quite often don't include things like land prices and trading. And then off to the side, slightly hazard models, things for earthquakes, floods and fire and disease, which may be used as decision support tools, which have relatively weak linkages to the rest of these kinds of models. Recent attempts to produce Nexus models I've highlighted here in blue, and these typically try to look at water, land and energy, but they don't often have a dynamical component. But there are beginning to be some attempts to change this kind of thing now. So if you look, for example, at the COPAN framework or at the AIMS framework, both of these have ambitions to produce models that would include all of this system. So I'm suggesting that economics here is not sufficient to be able to deal with all of these interconnected problems. For example, if we're looking at hazard management and things like flooding and displacement of people, a lot of the impact on people's livelihoods is psychological, and it involves the difficulties of coping with loss of livelihood, and tends to impact people who are living initially in deprived areas. And we've seen that with pandemics as well, that whether you are deprived or not, what your gender is and what your ethnicity is can affect your experience of pandemic disease. So we need to include these factors to be able to understand future impacts. And when you try to suggest that we should be doing this kind of stuff. The immediate reaction is typically, well, you can't make a model of everything. And my counter to that is, well, actually, you need to try to make a model of everything in order to be able to find out what it is that you can leave out. So we know that the dynamics are global and all of the interconnections in this can be vital to certain problems. We know that social justice is a global issue. We know that as you change scale, you get different dynamics operating, but those dynamics are interconnected across scales, and you don't necessarily know where to put the cut in the dynamics a priori in order to be able to represent what you're interested in correctly. So you will have a boundary condition somewhere, and that boundary condition itself may be dynamic, and you don't know what the dynamics are without being able to look at the out of boundary system, particularly for spatial scales, for example. So if you look at a capital city on a 30-year time scale, that city is almost certainly globally interconnected on that time scale. And in addition, the gathering of resources and the resource limitations that you have in creating models cannot be ignored. So in many cases, for example, in agent-based models, case studies, you will see households come into being without those households then requiring the time, energy, and resource required to build a house to live in, or to get access to water or to food. And those things matter, and they change the dynamics of the system. And again, you don't know what to leave out until you've tried to include those factors and make dynamical models on them. And all of this also bears on thinking that we've seen recently about things like digital twins, trying to make models of society that are close to or relatively realistic. And that realism, again, I would claim is a requirement. So if we look at the pandemic, it wouldn't be sufficient for the pandemic that we've seen recently to just present a stylized, idealized model of a small epidemic in order to be able to give policy advice. You need to be able to get close to the real social situation in the place where you're making that policy advice in order to be able to make meaningful statements. And even then, the uncertainties are really huge. The other thing is that you need multiple patterns to provide strong constraints on model systems. So again, if you make a case study where you focus only on, for example, a single time series, a dynamical model I'm talking here, and you fit that time series, it may be the case that you've made many unrealistic assumptions which would only be obvious if you looked at different outputs from the model. And you need to have multiple different patterns to constrain the models, and those patterns often have different spatial interconnections and different timescales associated with them. And then finally, in this set, there's a linkage to climate and ecosystem models in order to be able to deal with the multiple feedbacks that occur in climate systems and ecosystems when interacting with social systems. We really need to be looking at global scale. The final 2 points here are slightly different. I've mentioned ignorance already. We don't know what to exclude in terms of what's dynamically important. And then even if you disagree with the entirety of those first 10 reasons for why we need global social models, I would maintain that just trying to build these things, trying to put them together and make them work, will demand new ideas. It will demand cross-disciplinary thinking, and that those will be beneficial in and of themselves, even if you can't make a global social systems model work properly. So in order to do that, how could we construct one? Well, one way to do it is using agent-based models, and the state of the art now is that you can run on relatively modern hardware, modest hardware, models that have 7 billion agents. The first excellent example of this was Parker and Epstein's model in 2011, which looked at global transmission of flu. And unfortunately, they kind of published that paper and then didn't do any more work on it. And you can just imagine how much better prepared we would have been for the current pandemic if that model had been developed as a global model and integrated with other social systems over those 10 years between its publication and to date. They still use that model in the USA, but I haven't seen another example of it being used globally. Blandin et al.'s paper had 7 billion agents in, but that was looking at migration. But there are other models looking at more aggregated scale. So food and nutrition under global trade has been represented at country level. But there, it's difficult to know how you can be sure that you've included enough dynamics, as you've got to guess what the dynamics of a country might be. The other aspect that is interesting and has developed in the last few years is the idea of place-based models. So many models, such as the global ecosystem one I showed earlier, are based on a grid. Humans are very irregularly distributed and go to particular kinds of places. So by modeling the places, so houses and hospitals and shops and buses, you can actually build a model much more efficiently than if you try to cover the entire globe with a grid, and it's easier to parallelize these models. So one that I've been developing recently, on a single node of an HPC system, you can make a global pandemic of 4 billion agents, which runs within a few hours. So the technology and techniques to build these kinds of models already exist. What we haven't done is build in enough of the dynamics and the parameterizations to make them work for other things than disease. So what I would hope that we'll see over the next few years, possibly not modeling the Anthropocene as a whole, but it's just a catchy title, it's a good buzzword to put in. What I'd hope we see is truly dynamic, persistent Earth system models that include endogenous dynamic human behavior, helping us to unify multiple disciplines like land use change, economics, socio-technical and ecological systems, combining those with remote sensing and big data, and perhaps using machine learning to help us understand both the inputs and the outputs of those kinds of models. Multiple models being made by separate teams, so not just one model, but many competing ones that try to do different things. And the continuous improvement of these models over time by testing them against steadily longer time series, as we have seen with climate models starting from the 1950s, steadily increasing levels of skill. And this may allow us to start to test what actually can be meaningfully and successfully modeled in social systems. So can we model the whole of the 20th century? We've had climate models that do that for many years. What about being able to model the whole of the world and getting the model to produce a couple of world wars on its own spontaneously? And then we may be able to say whether there are things in these models that are robust predictions and understand what kinds of those things those might be, because we don't know for dynamic social models at the moment. Whether we can fill in areas where we don't have data using nowcasting, and this may help to improve our decision-making and to see how we can use these models for decision-making, particularly in things like the IPCC and IPBES for ecosystems, or maybe even in another body which is the social equivalent of those two things. So this is the last slide. I was asked to point out what might be some of the challenges for modeling at the moment, and there are many. In particular, the one under validation there of reflexivity, which is if you make a model of this sort, even telling people that you have a model may change their behavior. And this is obviously a principal difficulty in social systems that you don't get in physical or ecological systems, but many other difficulties, none of which I really have answers for, and which maybe we could address in discussion. Thank you for listening.